This section explains why creativity only looks impossible, and how Bowden dissolves that appearance. Creativity seems impossible only under a definition that quietly smuggles in the idea of ex nihilo, of something being brought from nothing, and nothing in the mind does that. Bowden's opening move is to split mystery from puzzle. A puzzle is a question you have not yet answered. A mystery is a question you cannot even coherently ask. The apparent mystery here is a conceptual artifact rather than a fact about minds. Novelty seems to force a choice between two bad options. Denial, saying the new thing was not really new, or magic, saying it could not have arisen from what preceded it. Both options are products of the smuggled definition, not of the phenomenon. Tame the definition, and the impossibility collapses into an ordinary psychological puzzle. How intuition works, a question answerable in computational terms. That is exactly the chapter's job in the arc of the book. It performs this conversion. It dissolves the paradox so that the question of how creativity happens becomes one that science is finally allowed to hold. This section explains why creativity looks impossible and how one move dissolves that illusion before any mechanism gets touched. Creativity looks impossible only under a bad definition. Take creation as ex nihilo, bringing form from nothing, and novelty splits into a false dichotomy. Either the new resembles what came before, so nothing is genuinely new, or it does not, and its arising is magic. Denial or wizardry with no third door. Bowden's opening move is to separate a mystery from a puzzle. A mystery is a question you cannot even coherently ask. A puzzle is unanswered, but tractable to science. Creativity seems mysterious only because of a conceptual knot in the word. Untie the definition, and it becomes a puzzle, a mental capacity, explicable like any other. The chapter clears ground. It dissolves the paradox before touching the mechanism. This section explains why a century of first-person testimony about creativity left its mechanism untouched, and what Bowden does about that. Every witness, Poincaré, Koestler, Coleridge, Polanyi, described creativity faithfully and explained it not at all. That gap is the chapter's whole payload. Bowden's move is dissolution. The phrase sudden illumination names the phenomenon but hides its mechanism, and that way magic lies. The compression is the single word intuition. Calling an insight intuitive is like calling a runner, a winner, true, reliable, and empty, because it labels the outcome rather than the process. So, the real question was never whether intuition is real. The real question is which ideas turned out right and how they were generated. The chapter's function in the arc is to convert a century of testimony into a list of well-posed mechanistic questions that the computational account must answer. This section explains the single move the chapter makes against every earlier account of creativity. Every prior account locates creativity without generating it. That is the whole move. Bath, bed, bus, introspection reports where insight arrives, never how. Poincaré's 4 phases name the timing. His colliding hooked atoms name a metaphor. Koestler's bisociation names a pattern. Each is a true label laid over an unopened box. The distinction the chapter turns on is description versus explanation. Sudden illumination faithfully reports the surface, yet taken as a cause. That way magic lies. The chapter demolishes by insufficiency, exposing the gap they all share rather than refuting any single predecessor. And so, it earns the book's demand for a mechanism that could actually produce novelty. This section explains why originality is not the impossibility it first appears to be. Originality looks impossible only under one demand, that creation happen ex nihilo, from nothing. Drop that demand, and the paradox dissolves. Bowden's move is to relocate surprise. The combination theorists made an error here. They treated a creative idea as shocking because it is improbable, a mere statistical outlier, an unusual juxtaposition. Bowden puts the shock elsewhere. A creative idea shocks because the world turned out differently from how we thought it could. The decisive shift is from probability to possibility. A creative idea is one that could not have occurred before, not merely one that did not. That could not is defined against a space of the currently thinkable, which is exactly what later chapters make mechanical. One bound on the claim, Bowden distinguishes P creative from H creative. P creative means novel to a single mind. H creative means novel to all of history. Only the first admits systematic explanation. This section explains why creativity is only paradoxical under one definition of originality, and how Bowden dissolves it. Creativity looks impossible only if originality means creation from nothing, ex nihilo. Bowden dissolves the paradox by moving the surprise from how we thought it could go, deeper than merely how we thought it would go. A merely novel sentence, a random jumble, a giant hedgehog absurdity could all have occurred before, since the same grammar generates them. A genuinely creative idea shocks for a different reason. The world turned out different from how we thought it could go, deeper than merely how we thought it would go. The word doing the real work is that mysterious could not. It is a computational could not, a possibility unreachable by the reigning generative rules. Creativity is therefore defined against a conceptual space, and the sense a mechanism can actually explain is P, creativity, novelty to one mind, rather than the more glamorous H, creativity. This section explains the chapter's core, primitive, that a mind is best understood as a map, a generative system that yields far more than any list could hold. Begin with a small picture. 2 rules for stringing beads. Generate, silently, the whole of addition. Every necklace a doll could wear is a true equation, and the space of them is infinite because no rule says stop. That is the chapter's primitive. A mind's competence is a generative system rather than a catalog. A map earns its name by yielding indefinitely many coulds and cannots from a handful of rules. A list of landmarks generates nothing new. Creativity is then exploration of such a space and, uniquely to minds, transformation of it, turning a computational cannot into a can. Style, theory, musical scale, each one is a map of the mind, itself living in the mind, guiding thought down some paths and not others. This section explains what a conceptual space is and how creativity acts on it. A conceptual space is a generative system, a set of rules, and its terrain is everything those rules can reach. The anchor is the necklace game, Hofstadter's PQ system, where the same rule that forbids also produces. Constraints do not merely constrain, they make thoughts possible. Creativity is then 3 moves on such a space. You can map it, you can explore its coulds and its cannots, or you can transform the rules so that a former cannot becomes a can. A map generates possibilities. A list of landmarks generates nothing. This is the primitive the rest of the book runs on. Creativity is what a mind does to the shape of its own possibility. This section lays out how a small rule set generates a vast space of possibilities. A finite rule set silently specifies an entire landscape of possibilities it never lists. English grammar implies every sentence. Chess implies every board. That is the move that does the work. The generative system is the compressed program, and the conceptual space is its unrolled output. Bowden gives a cartographic figure, maps versus map making, and it fixes the chapter's job. Computation supplies the activity of charting the mind, the map making itself, rather than better finished maps of it. Two verbs act on that space. A heuristic prunes movement through it. Applied deeply enough, a heuristic transforms the space itself. Think of Kekulé's closed curve or Schoenberg's chromatic scale. New regions appear and whole old ones cease to exist. Creativity edits the generator, not the terrain. This section explains Bowden's vocabulary for creativity. A creative act is a walk through a rule-defined space. This is Bowden's toolkit chapter, and it fixes the vocabulary the rest of the book runs on. 3 terms. Carry the frame. A generative system, meaning data together with action rules, implicitly defines a conceptual space of everything reachable. Heuristics prune and reshape the paths through that space. An effective procedure is any unambiguous step sequence that a machine faithfully executes. Here is the inversion the whole argument turns on. Constraints are the precondition for creativity, not its enemy. Without a rule-defined space, there is nothing to explore and nothing to transform. Creativity's magnitude is then just depth of edit on the generative tree. Touch a twig, and you get a variation. Cut the trunk, meaning a deep generative rule, and a whole new kind of space appears. This section explains creative connection and why it asks for a different kind of machine than the rule follower. Consider Coleridge's luminous water snakes. They did not come from his reading by cut and paste. The sources are too diffuse for that, and the ideas arrive already merged and transformed, fused rather than glued together. Between mere combination and genuine blending there is a gap, and that gap is exactly what a rule-following program cannot cross. It is what this chapter hands to a different substrate, Median 2s. Connectionist networks associate and merge as a native consequence of their wiring. They settle into a coherent whole rather than execute a recipe. The primitive, creative association lives in the medium as a property of it, not as a program. The medium runs. Livingston Lows gave the phenomenon a name: the hooks and eyes of memory. The network shows why the fit falls out of the architecture itself. This section explains what it means for combination to yield a genuinely new unity. The unicorn looks like conceptual cut and paste, horse plus goat plus narwhal, yet its neck belongs to no source animal. Coleridge's water snakes are not fishes. Plus snakes plus animalculae laid side by side, they are a blend, the sources merged and transformed. Combination of this kind is superposition rather than concatenation. This is the chapter's pivot in the book's arc. The novelty that matters is superposition, 2 structures overlaid into one, rather than tiles set next to each other in a mosaic. Superposition is exactly what a substrate of side-by-side symbols cannot do. That is why the argument turns here, away from symbol shuffling and toward the connectionist brain. It answers von Neumann's claim that the logic of the brain is not a program, without surrendering computation. This section explains Margaret Bowden's central move in reframing what the early art-making programs are for. Bowden refuses the obvious question. She does not ask whether the drawing programs, with Harold Cohen's AARON as the anchor case, rival human artists. Grant the point, on that question, they lose. She asks instead what they are for, and her answer is that they are early scouts sent into psychological territory the mind normally hides from itself. That reframing forces the inversion. The whole argument turns on. Creativity lives in the process of generation, in the exploring and the mapping and the transforming, and the finished image is beside the point. A novel, elegant picture proves nothing on its own. The Mandelbrot set is glorious and psychologically inert. What counts is whether the generator explores, maps, and psychologically inert. So, the chapter turns artificial intelligence from a rival into an instrument. A program is interesting exactly insofar as its inner workings illuminate how humans manage their own originality. This section explains where the property of creativity actually lives. Creativity is a predicate on the generating process rather than the finished artifact. A drawing counts as creative because of the path that reached it by exploring, testing, mapping, and transforming a conceptual space. Sheer novelty does not confer the property. The Mandelbrot set is unprecedented and cold. Margaret Boden's move is to relocate the property away from the output's novelty and into the generating mechanism itself. Novelty is neither necessary nor sufficient. Ideas that are P creative need not be H novel, and an elegant output can be generated mechanically. So Harold Cohen's AARON, introduced in Chapter 7, matters as an early scout into psychological territory. It is a working model whose inner workings illuminate how human artists manage their own originality. Its value lies there, not in beating human artists at their own game. This section places every so-called creative program on a single axis, which stratum of a conceptual space its act touches. Rank the candidates by that one measure, and the whole question of machine creativity resolves into a graded ladder. At the lowest rung, the program walks established paths. The soybean expert system is told everything it knows, pure Lovelace fodder, generating nothing its author did not already put there. One rung up, the program restructures the paths without moving the walls. ID3 finds the most efficient decision tree yet, but it cannot generate a fundamental surprise. It cannot surprise itself. Higher still, the program enlarges the space by adding rules. Meta. Dendril is the case that does this. At the top, the program transforms the primitive dimensions themselves. AM breathes integer and prime out of raw set theory. That single-graded ladder, explore versus transform the space, is the chapter's whole verdict on machine creativity. It lets you place the next program on the ladder before you have even met it. This section explains why creativity stops being a mystery. It stops the moment you grade it by what a program does to a conceptual space, rather than by where its ideas seem to come from. Chapter 8 is Boden's existence proof. The soybean pear sets an expert system that was told everything. Lovelace vulnerable and scoring 83%, beside an inductive program that was told nothing substantive, ID3 reaching approximately 100%. And elegant. This is one task solved by exploring a space versus restructuring a space versus restructuring it. Value and elegance, her twin criteria, fall to machines, provably. Lady Lovelace's objection collapses, a program genuinely P creates, and Bacon's family edges into H creation. Creativity was never generation from nothing. It was efficient search and transformation of a structured space all along. This section pries apart 4 words. The romantic collapses into 1: chance, chaos, randomness, and unpredictability. That we cannot predict a creative act does not make it random. Unpredictability has many sources, and only some of them are noise. a conceptual space large enough throws up surprises no one can forecast, yet each move is constrained, judged, and rule-generated. The surprise measures the depth of the space, not any roll of the dice. Bowden offers a test. Dictionary and pencil randomness yields only first-time curiosities, not radical surprises. And chance contributes only when a prepared mind can evaluate what it tosses up. So here is the inference. The chapter exists to sever, unpredictable, therefore beyond mechanism. Cut that implication, and creativity stays inside science with no diminishment. This section explains how a scientific account of creativity survives the romantic objection. The Romantics wield 4 words against a science of creativity: chance, chaos, randomness, unpredictability. Each one cuts both ways. The chapter makes a single move, which is to sever a tie. The Romantics smuggle in the assumption that to explain a thing is to predict it. Break that link, and the objection collapses. Deterministic chaos is the wedge. These are processes fully governed by known law, yet unforecastable in practice. Understanding without prediction. So creative. Surprise, real as it is, no longer proves science blind to it. Explanation and predictability are independent axes. The Romantic case rests on conflating the two, and once that assumption falls, a scientific account of originality stops looking impossible. This section explains why a genius like Mozart is not built differently from you. Mozart differs from you the way a fortune differs from a meal ticket. The engine is the same in both cases. What genius has is a larger space of opportunity running on that same engine, rather than some extra faculty you lack. That is the whole move of the chapter. It collapses the elite and everyman split that the rest of the book has been building toward. The Romantic words, intuition and inspiration, name no special organ. They name ordinary powers used with unusual skill, noticing something, being reminded of something, seeing an analogy. These are powers everyone already has. The apparent suddenness of genius is an artifact of bad introspection, not evidence of a supernatural channel. Genius is a matter of degree rather than of kind. It is exceptional use of a computational resource that everyone owns. So, elite dissolves into everyman amplified, and creativity becomes explicable rather than sacred. This pot explains why genius runs the same mind everyone else runs, only driven further. Genius uses no different engine. It is the same one, pushed harder. The anchor that carries the whole chapter is Bowden's contrast between winning a meal ticket and winning a fortune. Winning a fortune needs no faculty that the pool's loser lacks. It merely opens a space of ambition that the meal ticket never could. Mozart differs from you the way a fortune differs from dinner. The difference is one of enabled space, not of substance. The Romantic myth says that the great historical creators, the H-creators, are set apart. That myth survives only on introspective testimony, and introspection is prejudice-driven retrospection. You see what you expect to see. Strip the myth away and creativity collapses to the skilled use of the computational mind. Everyone runs. This chapter is the book's ethical hinge. Elite framing is self-fulfilling discouragement. Everyman framing is what makes psychological creativity. Creativity, worth attempting. This section explains why the fear that has run through the whole book turns out to be misplaced. That fear was that explaining creativity dissolves it, what Blake called Newton's sleep. It collapses once you see that demystification does not work the same way. Everywhere. Consider the hoverfly. It meets its mate by one hardwired rule, an approach, angle mapped to a fixed turn, with no mid-flight feedback. Learning this rightly kills the wonder, because the wonder was only ignorance, wearing the mask of respect. Now consider the human mind. Examined computationally, it turns out richer than we had credited, so the very same lens that flattens the fly deepens us. Here is the step that does the work. Explanation subtracts wonder only where the wonder was error. Where the thing exceeds what you assumed, explanation adds wonder instead. Humans are not hoverflies, and that asymmetry is the entire title. This section explains how explanation changes wonder and in which direction explanation moves. Wonder in whichever direction your prior estimate was wrong. When you had overestimated a thing, understanding it deflates your awe. When you had underestimated it, understanding it inflates your awe. Take the hoverfly. It meets its mate in mid-air by one hardwired rule, mapping approach angle to turn, with no perception of the other fly at all. Explaining that deflates the awe, because we had overestimated the fly. Borden's turn is the reverse. Aim the same computational lens at Kekulé or Coleridge, and it does the opposite, exposing machinery subtler than recredited, so wonder inflates. To abandon awe merely because a thing was explained is the fallacy of the compass. Picture the child crushed to learn that any circle springs from one instrument before maturing to find the principle more marvelous than the objects it draws. Science demystifies only what stood propped on ignorance. Genuine structure. It magnifies.